Welcome to the first in a series of interviews with prominent people from the adventure community. Today I have with me Eric Phillips, who is a master polar guide. He's made some 30 expeditions just to the North and South Poles and dozens more elsewhere, Svalbard, the high Arctic, and elsewhere. Welcome, Eric.
Great to be with you, Jerry.
So you're based in Australia, and although Australia has, I guess you could call it skiing, it's not known for its winters. How did you become a polar expert?
Yeah, pretty good question, because, we're kind of renowned for our deserts and our wide open, dry, arid landscapes. We get a lot of snow. We have a good ski season. And I was just introduced into the outdoors by my parents, who loved camping and the outdoors and hiking. And so then it was a natural extension for me to get into the areas that I really wanted to learn about, and that was the polar environments.
But how did you get the idea? Like I grew up in Montreal, and so I was only a 12-hour bus ride from Labrador, which is subarctic. So, I had at least an introduction to winter and blizzards, but how did you know that you were interested in the poles?
There was a book on my parents' bookshelf that I recall when I was 10 or 12 or so, pulling it out, flicking through, and I saw a photograph of a guy dressed up in a Michelin Man costume, standing on a white platform with a dome of blue sky above him and just ice all around. And I just wanted to be that guy. I wanted to know why he was dressed like that and standing on a place like that and where those places were. So that kind of embedded in my mind and led me on a journey into the outdoors and ultimately to the poles.
Do you know who that guy was in retrospect, or was he just some bloke?
Some random dude, probably working at the South Pole Station or something like that. It was kind of like a National Geographic magazine or something similar to that.
Well, it's very funny because a lot of people fixate on places they're totally unfamiliar with as kids by seeing a photo in a book. There's a friend here, I live in the Canadian Rockies, and there's one guy here who became a very good climber, has been around climbing all his life. He saw a picture of Ahmed Dablam in a photo book when he was 7. And he fixated on that. And the minute he left university, he moved west to the Rockies. And he's been there ever since. So those stray pictures lodge with us sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's one of the reasons why anytime anyone contacts me with just an iota of a plan or an inkling of a dream or something, that I'm very careful not to whitewash it or to squash their dreams and ideas, even though they might be a lifetime away from getting to that point. Everyone has that little spur of inspiration somewhere along their lives, and so long as they just keep putting one foot, in front of the other, there's no reason why they can't achieve that dream, and it can stem from a simple photograph.
Well, it's funny because although you and I have spent a great deal of time in the polar regions, we haven't really crossed paths. I've never been to Antarctica. The parts of the Arctic, I don't go to the North Pole, but you and I did sort of cross paths at one point fairly early on, in that we both climbed Barbeau Peak, which is the highest mountain in Canada and the United States east of the Rockies.
Yeah, indeed. And it was my first polar expedition to Ellesmere Island, and particularly to climb Barbeau Peak. And it's a rarity actually to speak to someone, aside from the other two guys who were on that team, to speak to someone who's actually climbed that peak, because it's very remote. It's not very high. It's around 2,600 meters, but its remoteness and its difficulty to get to makes it a pretty special place.
Well, that's it. It's basically an 800-meter pimple of frozen gravel erupting from an ice cap. Right. And I think you did it a few years before I did, but when I did it, there were some other people doing it. And I noticed a year later in the American Alpine Journal that the climb that I did with a couple of people was actually noted there because it was only the 6th climb of Barbeau Peak on record, which is hilarious because, I mean, I am anything but a climber, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's hardly, it's a steepish trek, I guess.
Yeah. So now you've made a specialty as a polar guide. Now, a lot of people, in the outdoors have worked as guides, know the guiding business. But polar guiding is a bit different in that these are extremely expensive treks. I think the guides do pretty well from what I've heard. Where do you find people who are willing to shell out $70,000 to ski to the South Pole?
Yeah, they are incredibly expensive journeys to do, much like, climbing to the top of, or being guided to the top of Mount Everest, of course. And there is always a percentage of the population that have the kind of money that can pay for those kind of adventures. And look, there's certainly an industry there, and we make our living from doing this kind of thing. But it's certainly not easy. We don't have a flood of people coming to us and knocking on our doors and saying, take us. There's a finite number of people that have both the dream and the financial backing to be able to fulfill these dreams. So the industry is kind of self-regulating in terms of that money regulation, if you like. It's there's only a certain number of people that can do it, and therefore there's only a certain guiding population that it can support.
Now, I suppose it's really important that you largely target places like the North Pole and South Pole because they're icons. And so that draws the people that are willing to in the same way that people will be guided up Everest for lots of money, they will be guided to the North Pole and the South Pole, whereas going somewhere else in the Arctic, though it might be an even better experience, doesn't quite have the pull. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The North and South Poles are iconic grails, if you like. That they are the ends of the Earth. And even though there's very little there, the South Pole, of course, there's the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, is a research station run by the Americans. At the North Pole, there is literally nothing. So much so that when you stand at the North Pole, if it's drifting, are no longer at the North Pole minutes later because the wind and the currents are pushing you away from it. So, and when we fly to, let's say, 89 degrees in order to ski then the last degree to the North Pole, standing at 89 degrees looks no different than what it is when you arrive at the North Pole. So in many respects, it's like that, the saying that we're on a treadmill, and it appears as if we're not really moving, particularly on the higher reaches of the Antarctic plateau, where you just might get a cloud drifting by, but otherwise it's much the same.
Well,
so
I did a trip a few years ago with a friend who had not done a sledding trip before. And he asked how he could train. He was already pretty fit. And I said, but how he could train psychologically. And I said, well, stare at a blank wall for 8 hours. And
yeah, quite right. They're very internalized journeys, and particularly skiing to the South Pole or anything in Antarctica. Once you get up onto the high plateau, you've got your headgear locked down and your ruff around you and your goggles and your face mask, and you feel very much like an astronaut cocooned within this shell, this protective shell. And there's something superbly wonderful about that, because you can internalize all of this stuff that's happened in your life suddenly comes to the fore. You can process things, you can solve problems, you can apologize to people who you've wronged in the past. You can do all these amazing things. And along the way, you are trekking across one of the most committing environments on Earth.
Now, what type of person does best? Would it be like a sociable introvert? Would it be would it be an extrovert? Who would do the best in that environment where you are both dealing with other people and it is a team, and yet you are essentially spending all your time alone? Because as you're trekking, you may be with 5 other people or 6 other people, but you're in a line and you're not talking to each other for 2 hours between brief breaks.
Yeah, you want to be the kind of person that's comfortable within their own shell, who can entertain themselves with their their own and with their own ideas and plans. And then when they're inside the tent at the end of the day and you've locked into that one-on-one or maybe 3 people in the tent, then you've got to be able to understand the necessity for being a social being as well. It's important to be able to communicate, but actually part of that communicating is recognizing that that other person needs their space and their quiet time as well. We get a lot of quiet time during the day while we're trekking, but then that's equally important in the tent at night. So it's horses for courses. It's for people who are extroverted, so long as they can come down in their extrovertness, and it's for introverted people who can bring that up a little bit and find a mean, if you like.
Do people get along well, or are there some pretty big egos, people who want to have bragging rights, that, as with Everest, that they've been to the North or the South Pole?
Yeah, there's a bit of everything. The polar environments, particularly when you get up high and into the extreme cold, are very leveling environments. So when we take novices and amateurs into this environment, they very much turn to the guide as the expert and follow their instructions, watch what they do and mimic that, and try to fast track into a comfortable zone. Because once they reach that comfortable zone, then they can really start to enjoy themselves. Yeah.
Okay, so, and because the business of guiding to the poles and so on has become much more popular over the years. Like when I first started doing polar travel, there were no guides. There were a lot of beginners who would show up in Resolute in the Canadian Arctic, and they didn't even know how a stove worked. And now guides have shortcutted that. But one of the things that has happened with guides is that a lot of the routes done are the same routes, and that leads us to one of our topics of conversation, and that is that as you do the same route again and again, you're trying to discern how what you have done is a little bit different than other people. So in the last year, you say you have spent a great deal of time trying to get the language right, so that when you actually say unsupported or solo or circumnavigation, everyone knows what you're talking about. You're not just having everyone make definitions as they go along. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing?
Yeah, the Polar Expeditions Classification Scheme, or PECS, is something that I think has been on the agenda for experts, if you like, for a long time. It's something that we've needed to address for a long time, because there have been people in the past that have applied their own terminology or ancient terminology to their expedition. So we've tried to create a vocabulary that will be accepted worldwide amongst polar professionals and guides, but also the novices and amateurs who are first coming into this space. And so you're exactly right. In particular, words like unsupported, the word actually that you mentioned there. What does that actually mean? In the past, no one was really quite sure. Is it the fact that you are not getting resupplies between start and end? Is it the fact that you're not using kites, this kind of external energy power, to propel you from point A to point B? Is it that you're not going to ski on a graded road or a prepared road that we do see in places like Greenland and Antarctica that can be avoided to give you a bit more of a pure journey? Yeah. So we've actually now knuckled down and determined exactly what these words mean. To be unsupported.
But isn't it a little bit random deciding whether kites are supported or unsupported and a road is supported or unsupported? Like you are really just making a judgment call. Who's to say that kites are still unsupported and a graded road is not?
Yeah, so what we've done here is we've completely eliminated any bias that's thrown upon types of travel that use different forms of energy. Imagine the Pacific Ocean, which is shared by sailors, by rowers, by kayakers, by all forms of disciplines, if you like. Mm-hmm. We've applied the same thing to the polar environments, where we love to move across ice. So let's allow these various disciplines, these modes of travel that we call them, to be independently classified. So no longer can a manhauler say that a kite skier or a snow kiter is an assisted form of travel. It's not. It's just that a snow kiter is applying their craft on the ice as a manhauler is. So to be precise about the term unsupported, the main stipulations of being unsupported is to not get any resupplies between start and end, not to ski on any roads between start and end. They're the two most important. And then we've got a whole bunch of other levels, about 5 or 6 stipulations under that unsupported scheme. And we're about to launch this. So we're about to launch PECs, and people will get a very clear understanding on how then to label their expedition.
Do you have the website name yet that people can go to, and an estimate on when the site will be up?
We've only just started building the site now. It's likely going to be another month or two. Okay. The website will be pec-s.com, so PECs, but with a dash in between. And it will have all the information there, in particularly a glossary or a lexicon of what every word that's used in our field of polar expeditioning. We've given that a definition, so people can go there. And we'll also have a tool, a kind of label generator. So for novices who go there and who don't want to screw up and use the wrong kind of terminology, we'll have a generator that allows them to develop a label for their particular expedition.
Now you're saying, you said that the Guinness Book of Records has signed on to PECs, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we will be announcing this in the very near future. They have long required a tool in which to adjudicate records or proposals that people go to Guinness and say, well, here's what I've done in the polar environment. I was the first to blah, blah to the South Pole. And Guinness have always worked on pretty archaic definitions.
How did they define it till now? How have they defined it to this point?
Well, prior to PECs, there was the Rules of Adventure, and they were written up by the previous owners of Explorers Web, your employer. Yes. And that was a great first attempt at putting together some kind of classification system. But it was very, very loose, and could be a lot of interpretation that could go into the definitions that they came up with. So we've expanded on that. We're very thankful for the work that they've done prior to us. And we think that we've come up with a scheme that is both usable and easy to understand, and that will last for a long time into the future.
Now, I must say I have a list of some of your sample paths here. And just looking at them, I would not like to have to describe precisely in an article. We would lose a lot of readers if we were trying to distinguish between a full alternate return expedition, an alternate return expedition, a full return expedition, a return expedition, a full expedition, and just a plain old expedition.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, Jerry. And it's one of the reasons why we have very clear graphics to explain this. It's really difficult to understand in a pure definition what a full unsupported return or alternate return South Pole expedition is. But when we explain it in a graphic and we have a look at the start and end points and the direction, then it's much easier to understand. And the reason we've done this is because not everyone wants to just ski to the North or South Pole from a coastline. Some want to make a return journey, or they want to keep going to the other side, or they want to stop inland, or they want to go to the pole and then come part way back. And they all have different paths and different margins, which are the start and end points. So we have classified all of those individual paths, if you like, routes and expeditions. So
let me throw a few examples out at you. I've done 20 sledding expeditions myself, and sometimes, you know, I as I said, don't go to the North or South Poles, but I'm up in the high Arctic. a partner and I might sled around for 2 months. And the last 3 or 4 days, we come upon a snowmobile track from the village that's our destination. And for us, often the snow is good, in which case the track might actually have worse snow than the wind-packed snow. But if it's not, we'll jump on that track, and I certainly don't consider that unsupported. But you would, I suppose.
Look, primarily we're dealing with expeditions to the very high polar regions. So we're concentrating on 3 areas: the Arctic Ocean, Antarctica, and Greenland. And then we say that there are other areas that fall within PEX. So your expedition, you could go to PEX and say, well, how do we fit in? How is my expedition classified? And really, there's only one road at the moment that we do classify as being, as rendering your expedition supported. And that's called the South Pole Overland Traverse. And it runs from McMurdo Station across the Ross Ice Shelf, up the Leverett Glacier, and across the plateau to the South Pole.
So for example, if somebody was skiing across the Arctic Ocean and they came across the plowed runway at Borneo, and they used that for 2 miles or whatever, they're still unsupported.
That would still be an unsupported expedition, because that is a transitory groomed runway, if you like. It's not there all the time. Sure, they could make the option of skiing a kilometer away from it and not even seeing it in the first place, but small things like that, there's no threat of losing your unsupported status. Even if you were to ski in the tracks of another team, PEX would look at that and say, well, okay, you might not officially be regarded as a supported expedition, but take a look at our code of integrity, which is part of PEX, and see how you fit within that. Can you really claim to be an unsupported expedition if you're going to ski in the tracks of a team and follow their route for 2 months to the South Pole? Can you really claim that to be an unsupported trip? PEX would say that, well, yes, you are still unsupported, but are you going to be able to live with yourselves if you claim that?
Now, here's another example. To do a full North Pole expedition, do you have to start from land?
Well, it's a really interesting one, because at the time that I was... Yeah, thank you, Jerry. At the time that I was putting this definition together, skiing to the North Pole from land, who would be out on the ice but Børge Ausland and Mike Horn, who were completing a crossing, not from land to land via the North Pole, but from a mid-ocean point to a mid-ocean point. So I had to look at the definition that I had of an Arctic Ocean crossing via the North Pole, which at the time stipulated that you needed to start from a coastline and finish at a coastline. What we say now is if you can reach that mid-ocean start and that mid-ocean finish by sea, then that's part of the access and exit of your journey. It's not a difficult, it is a very difficult thing to reach those 2 points by ship. And if you can do that and then still complete a crossing of 1,500 kilometers minimum and cross what we call the Northern Poles line, which is a line that connects the North Pole with the Northern Pole of inaccessibility, that kind of is the central part of the Arctic Ocean. If you can satisfy all of that, then you will be a full North Pole crossing, or a full crossing of the Arctic Ocean.
What if you use a helicopter to get to the ice from land? Not a ship, but a helicopter, as on the north coast of Russia.
No, that's then you would not be classified as a full expedition. You must either start from land and finish at land to be a full crossing, or you have to have a mid-ocean start and a mid-ocean finish, and those other factors that I mentioned. If you fly by twin otter or by helicopter to a point that is offshore or mid-ocean, you cannot be a full expedition. We need to reserve this label of full, which means full length, by the way. We need to reserve that for expeditions who go that extra mile. For example, there's some really classic examples of that. Audun Tolfsen and Timo Paulo, they skied from the North Pole to Svalbard, not just to Svalbard, but all the way to Longyearbyen. and they didn't have the money to fly to the North Pole. They could fly to Borneo. They skied from Borneo to the North Pole first before they went all the way down to Svalbard. That's going the extra mile. You know, Mike Horn, when he did his transantarctic crossing, snow kiting crossing, he went in by ship, by his boat Pangaea, he came out by ship on the other side. That's a full crossing. When, Rune Gjeldnes and Tori Larsen did their crossing of Greenland, they parachuted into the south coast of Greenland so that they could get right on that southern coast and start their journey from there. That's going the extra effort to claim a full crossing.
Yeah, yeah. So what you're trying to do is what other adventure activities like ocean rowing or climbing have done. Climbing has the Yosemite decimal scale, the 512D. Ocean rowing, the Ocean Rowing Society has a list of very careful stipulations, and they've had that for decades, haven't they?
Yes, they have. And I've been somewhat inspired by the work that the Ocean Rowing Society has done and how they've classified rowing expeditions and journeys. And so we've done the same kind of thing. We've really knuckled down on the terminology and the lexicon that we've come up with. And we've made it much clearer now for people who want to undertake almost any polar expedition, to the point where I started working on what I call the map code, which was distilling everything down from a label down to a code using letters A, B, and C. A being the most pure expedition through to a different rating, if you like, not higher or lower. We don't grade expeditions better or worse than one or the other. But the map code, there are some complexities in there. So we haven't yet been able to crack that nut that allows us to develop a system a little bit like climbing codes, grading codes. Somewhere down the line, we might be able to do that, but it's the more we worked on definitions, the more we understood that this map code was a very difficult thing to introduce at the moment anyway.
So basically your PEX is going to focus on Antarctica, the Arctic Ocean / North Pole, and Greenland. Like someone who does the Northwest Passage, you're not looking at that in quite the same discerning way, because, for example, the Northwest Passage, there is not one clear starting point or ending point. Some people have said that if you ski Bellet Strait, you're doing the Northwest Passage. Other people say that you need to go from Kugluktuk to Pond Inlet. You have to do the full transit. So there's a lot of routes in the polar regions that you're not going to look at in the same way. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And look, maybe that's something for PEX to look at further down the line, specific expeditions. But at the moment, we're looking at, three major things. And I was talking about this map code, MAP, margins, which are the start and end points. How do you classify a coastline of Antarctica when there are actually two of them? You've got the ice shelves and you've got seaward edges of ice shelves, but you've got landward edges of ice shelves. And most expeditions are using these, what we call inner coastlines, or these landward edges. So they're the M part of the map, which are the margins. Aid, which is the support that you're using along the way, or the denial of support along the way. And P is the path. So all of those crazy paths you talked about. Expeditions, return expeditions, alternate return expeditions, crossing, circumnavigations, loops, and so on.
What do you think the future of polar travel is going to look like? Not from a perspective of climate change, but just what it like again, 30 years ago, there weren't really guides. What is it going to be like in 50 years? How is the industry, or how is the adventure going to change?
Yeah, I think guiding has somewhat changed the face of adventuring. When I, cut my teeth in the polar regions, as you would have, Jerry, there were no guides aside from perhaps Inuits that you could engage to take you out into the polar environment, or locals of some sort. We just had to get out there and learn from scratch how to operate a stove, how not to fall through thin ice, how not to fall into a crevasse, how to prevent frostbite and polar bear encounters and those kind of things. Now we can fast track all that. We as guides can fast track and allow people without the specific skills to go to environments that they could never have thought were reachable even 10 or 15 years ago. In
Just
50 years,
just to put in a word for the traditional guides, of course, all the explorers, the explorers of the 19th century had guides of their own, but they were Inuit guides.
yeah.
And often how the explorers depended on how intelligently they adapted to the Inuit way of travel. But these were all guides who essentially they hunted for the explorers because they were out for such long periods of time. They needed to hunt for food. They built their snow houses. They essentially they sewed the clothing that they needed to survive. So actually guides have been around for centuries. It's just the contemporary idea of guiding the poles and Greenland that is just a relatively new phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. And I was involved in the establishment or the founding of the International Polar Guides Association, which has now been running for more than 10 years. So we have a dedicated group of guides, master polar guides and polar guides. Master polar guides work on sea ice and land ice, and polar guides on land ice alone. And, you know, we've done a lot of work in professionalizing the industry of polar guiding, but we certainly understand that prior to us, there were people working in this space. It's just that, you know, the term polar guide really kind of wasn't a thing. And we feel very proud in the work that we've done too, because we are making these polar environments available to people who perhaps would never have the opportunity to see them otherwise, and experience them in a way that is very akin to the way explorers felt them all those years ago. You know, the difference now, of course, with polar guides is that we rely on logistics services to get us to point A. Then we will get ourselves between point A and B, and then we need to use those services to get ourselves out of point B, you know, the end point. Whereas those expeditioners of years ago, part of the journey was getting to the start point and getting out from the other side too. We no longer need to deal with that, and that is actually a massive one of the biggest changes between contemporary expeditioning and expeditions of past.
Although the most impressive polar journey in recent years was the done in the old-fashioned way by Børge Ousland and Mike Horn, who sailed their boat, jumped off their boat like Nansen and Johansen, and then just started skiing.
Absolutely groundbreaking. Yeah,
it can still be that sort of old-fashioned means of travel can still be done, even though it has become a lot more regulated and become a lot more, as you say, reliant on the logistics providers.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, it's interesting because I'm having this discussion at the moment about, you know, how tough do we need to be within PECS, this classification scheme, for people to satisfy our, you know, pretty stringent criteria on what a full expedition is. And should we be able to have some sort of tolerance of people not quite being able to reach an outer coastline of Antarctica because it's difficult to get to, or it's going to impinge on the time available for them to go, you know, to their objective? How tough should we be? And, you know, in my view, we should be tough on and shouldn't give away too easily these full ratings or these unsupported ratings, because they are achievable. And Børge and Mike proved that with that crossing, as have a number of expeditions in the past. And I think within PECS, we need to reserve those terminologies for those people who do go that extra mile.
Final point. What do you think a good definition of the explorer's Grand Slam should be? In the polar regions, should it be just a last degree, or should you have to do the whole North Pole, whole South Pole to actually be given credit for that achievement? as
Yeah, I
the one
always,
Korean guy did.
yeah, and that's right. And is groundbreaking and will remain so, because I don't think anyone else has achieved what he did, and that is to ski. If you're going to select the explorers, get to the North Pole, start from land, either Severnaya Zemlya, on the Russian side, or Ward Hunt Island or Ellesmere on that side, and go all the way across the Arctic Ocean to the North Pole. And the South Pole, you should be starting from an outer coastline or a seaward coastline and getting to the South Pole. That may well change because of climate change. It's now becoming more and more difficult to conduct long expeditions on the Arctic Ocean, but again, we refer to Berger and Mike's
Yeah.
expedition.
I have never seen anyone go at that time of year. And, in my history, I've seen two or three people try to do what they called summer expeditions, and they failed. They got all much bogged down in porridge ice, and they didn't get very far. I've never seen anyone go in early fall and finish in early winter. That was quite astonishing.
Totally groundbreaking. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for this conversation. I hope we will have a chance to talk again.
You bet. Thanks, Jerry.